Okay, awesome. So, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. The Department of Transnational Italian Studies, my colleagues who are there, and I are very, very pleased to welcome here at Bryn Mawr College Benedetta Catti Deresmini. She's the first guest of the Department of the Transnational Italian Studies Department from this year. So we are very excited to have her here. So this talk, as you may have noticed from the poster, spans across Italian studies, the history of art, and gender studies. And so I would really
and also Lithuanian studies.
Lithuanian studies, Soviet Union studies. So definitely an interdisciplinary talk. And so I would like to really thank the co-sponsors of this event, so the Department of History of Art and the Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Anita is here, and we want to thank them for the excellent support. So just a few information about Benedetta Catti Deresmini. She is an independent curator and art critic in Rome, as well as a professor of curatorial practices in Rome. She's interested in contamination between art and artists, and in the role of creative action as a social process. She's involved in gender studies, and she's created many international exhibitions, among which I will recall just the Magic Carpets, what a nice name, which is a long-lasting transnational project co-financed by Creative Europe Large Scale, which was designed to boost visibility for neglected, emerging, and feminist artists throughout Europe, so between Italy, Lithuania, and many more countries. So the title of her talk is Against Dogma, Feminist Artists and Religion between Italy and East Europe, and I really hope you will enjoy it. So I wish to thank Benedetta for accepting our invitation, and I gladly give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Luca, for the invitation. Thank you, Bryn Mawr, for having me here, for having me invited. I'm really honored. For me, it's actually the first time I'm giving a lecture in here, so in United States. So I've been doing other lectures, but always like on Zoom. So we can be national, but I mean, it's less important, I believe, that to be here in presence. So for me, it's really an honor. Probably it's not working, the microphone, or I don't know. It's working?
Yeah. Just muted some people, and I'll stop sharing.
Yeah. So Against Dogmas, Feminist Artists and the Religion between Italy and Lithuania. Yes, it's quite like a challenging title, but I was really always interested in these two countries that are really different. And since I always studied gender studies, once I pick up one book that I brought to you here, that is Maria Gimbuta's studies. Is an archaeology that she died in 1994, so a very long time ago. And she was Lithuanian, but she was based here in United States. But we will discover her later. So I will start talking about the word dogma. The Merriam-Webster Encyclopedia defined the words dogmas as something held as an established opinion, a fundamental principle. The term acquired this meaning only after the Counter-Reformation. The title for my presentation, Against Dogmas, is intended to highlight the role of women artists in the rebellion against the tenets pre-established by society, and in particular by the Church, which has long considered women inferior to men. For centuries, the women was viewed by the Church as a temptress. the vessel of perdition, an emissary of Satan, and his evil powers, or as an angel woman or Madonna woman, but above all, obviously, as a mother, a Christian mother, needless to say. For many women, religion is a strong element of oppression that has been passed down through the ages. The women artists analyzed here are thus criticizing in various ways official culture and traditional religious thought. Growing awareness of their oppressed condition and identification as active subject was supported by the idea of gender aggregation and separation as an indispensable method in the struggle for liberation. Those ideas pushed some women intellectuals in Eastern Europe, specifically, as I was telling you before, in Lithuania and in Italy, to become the protagonist of the most avant-garde types of artistic experimentation. In Italy, this phase flowered in 1960s and in violent opposition to the lingering vestige of the 19th century society, as well as to the nascent mass media society, while in Lithuania it flourished quite not so long time ago, between the end of the last century, just in 1990, and at the beginning of the new millennium, in opposition to the period of Soviet occupation and repression. In Lithuania, the conceptual shift of paradigm from modern self-expression to postmodern self-deconstruction self-deconstruction coincide with historical changes, the singing revolution, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the reestablishment of Lithuanian independence. The last decade of the 20th century was the most fruitful time for the Lithuanian women artists presented here. If we traverse Europe, heading the East, we realize that the process of liberation, conquest of political and civil rights for women is closely linked to the period of democratization and liberation from Soviet occupation. In a country like Lithuania, the activities of women organization prohibited during the period of occupation only re-emerged, as I was telling you, in 1990 when the state's independence was re-established. For Lithuanian women artists, despite the new outlook of openness to the international scene, local culture has remained particularly important. The work they produce inevitably draws on their experience, imbued with the culture of a frontier people, which, as such, is a fertile terrain for contamination. Their work bear the marks of a constant, vigorous allusion to the overarching Catholic doctrine. In Italy, however, the constant search of women artists for individual style and identity developed during the process of simmering political and cultural resentment exploded at the end of the 60s. So 30 years of difference, and remained within the discursive frame of a silent and powerful wave of expression. The propensity innate in women, especially in Italy, for communication uncontaminated by the common mindset, constitutes the link between the tenacious civil rights battles of the feminist movement and the various artistic movements associated with visual forms of poetry. So, visual poetry. I don't know if you ever heard this movement of visual poetry, but it was really quite famous in the 60s in Italy. The common, especially between and among women artists, the common denominator of which is embodied in the written, shouted, and this insistent word, a weapon of immeasurable semantic potential. In 1970, the Italian artist Mirella Bentivoglio, she is nowadays at the Venice Biennial in the main pavilion, highlighted this consideration. Differences depend on different psychological structures and the traces innate in each one of us of age-old experience of different roles linked to two genders. The woman had a different, totally private command of words. She gave language to her children. She knew language as spiritual energy, as space, as matter. The bureaucracy of words was alien to her and in a certain sense adversarial. This makes women extremely suited to a new genre of poetic communication based on the linguistic sign blended with the material image. So here is Mirella Bentivoglio. I would like to focus my attention here on a few words of Mirella Bentivoglio, which are essential to understanding not only the predication of the female gender aimed at the assumption of the self, but also toward the aspiration of the spiritual absolute, which is in a way denied. In those years, awareness of discrimination towards the female universe was strong in many artists. For the artists, the distinction of the genders topos of male culture has to be combated, starting from the very disarticulation of the language. So we start here from the very early disarticulation of the language. Bentivoglio's work guides us in a semantic unpending, where simple shifts reveal double meaning, opening up diverse, disorienting perspective. The most essential work to understanding this binary language is certainly l'assente, the absent. So it doesn't go. Why? Maybe it's too far away. Okay. Okay. So the absent. You should unmute the person that are linked.
Se non sul finale dove la tua vocalità è emersa molto di più rispetto
Sorry for this. It always happens, but in any case, I will. Okay, yeah, great. L'assente. So as you see here, don't consider this part of the screen, just consider it's not very well to be projected, but the artwork is only this. So l'assente is an image of the letter L with an apostrophe. The L is white, as you can see, on a black background. The apostrophized L, usually an article that predicates a noun, becomes rather a corporeal article to support an uncorporeal noun, the black background. The article has become more perceptible than the noun. It is no longer depends on the actual existence of the natural reality of the word, but is grammar with no function. Because, you know, in Italian, the L, introduce the noun, but without noun, it has no function. The apostrophe infinitely apostrophize what is unexpressed in a constant postponement of the logos to be spoken. The impossibility of the term being spoken implies for the article liberation from the predominance of a set meaning. The literal value remains without textual determination. The letter overcomes any verbal subservience, removing itself from the domain of the grammar, opening up to a horizon of grammar without noun. It is an article that no longer articulates the words, the letter loses its functions and has no purpose in the discourse, negating its linguistic function. The apostrophe, in this case, has a primary function, is elevated as the spirit of a now dead letter. In these works, there seems to be a tension towards a union, toward a spiritual absolute that is promptly denied. In Bentivoglio's words, my work, she says, is a celebration of culture in an anthropological sense. She increasingly desubjectivized the attempt of a transgressive consecration of sign, of communication. I call them symbolic structures. In this case, the apostrophized letter represents the impossibility of saying the logos, and at the same time represent the absolute incarnation of the logos. To quote the philologist, which is quite important in Italy, Gianni Garrera, the article became word. In Hebrew, the L, an L with an apostrophe preceding the letter, is the root to indicate the God, which is quite interesting. The apostrophe shift produces the sun. So that is Leo, the I. An apostrophe on the E, if you go on the other, thank you. So we see the two letters, the E, e in Italian, which is also the verb to be. But to tell you, an apostrophe on the E has the same power as an accent in Italian. In the e, the third person singular of the verb to be in Italian, somehow binds to the condition of existing and to the very female condition of serving as connection, as juncture. In Bentivoglio's work, this function of juncture is momentarily obstructed to then assume the language into itself, the body of the letter, the flesh of the word. In the work Mutilazione per accentuazione, mutilation for accentuation, I would translate it in Italian in a bad way, 1978, the loss of the upper part of the E allows the other to become a formulation of being, third personal singular in Italian. The E, deprived of its upper line, has evolved and rises up to become a movement similar to accentuation, taking on the function of existence. For the artist Mirella Bentivoglio, the capital letter E has the form of a joint. She wrote, only in Italian and in Portuguese is the E an entire word. In other language, no, has no meaning. And the fact that in these two languages, these letter junctures correspond to a grammatical conjunction, seems to be a poetic thing already in itself, something like a magical coincidence. The relationship is what connects us to all the realities of the cosmos, and especially to the other human beings. It is a sign that, in a way, reconstitutes the unity of the species. I believe in the work of the artist, the letter E represents the perfect union between the logos and the matter and matter of all things. Mirella Bentivoglio, if you go to the other, okay. Mirella Bentivoglio expressed this union between the logos, intended as the word of Christian origin, so il verbo, and the matter in the word Dio. God does not limit the expression of the self, but encloses it and represents its substance. So you see how here in this particular artwork, she like write the letter Dio, which is God, but is also me, myself. Another Italian artist with American origins, she is Suzanne Santoro. She was born in New York, and perhaps one of the most radical of that era is, as I was telling you, Suzanne Santoro. Suzanne came to Italy from New York at the end of the 60s and was immediately engaged in feminist battles and in the assertion of obtainment of fundamental rights for women. In 1973, she published a small book that I brought you here, which is Towards a New Expression. I will let you give a look to this book, this is the second edition, and I will tell you why. So I was telling, so she published the first edition of these little books towards a new expression with the movement of Rivolta Femminile, a group initially made up by feminist activists as Carla Lonzi, which is a theoretician, and then artists like you maybe know, Carla Accardi, and of course, Suzanne herself. In this small pamphlet, Towards New Expression, the artist stresses how the pubis, along with signs and symbols linked to it, okay, thank you, are evidenced in Neolithic and Paleolithic sculpture. The artist then sets, now if you go to that one, yeah, the artist then sets out to redefine a visual sexual vocabulary consistent with the real and organic dimension of the female body. As you can see from the cover of the little pamphlet, but also from the inside part of the pamphlet. So she makes this links from the antiquities, from the antiquity sculpture and the sexual sex of the women. So the artist then set out to redefine, as I was telling, the female body. As expected, the pamphlet was censored, you can see here, as it was interpreted in a pornographic light. The public of that time was unable to understand the artist's desire to lend the female sex an image that was both rigorous and poetic, in order to rediscover an iconography that the course of history has obscured. If you can see, the little book that you have in your hand is quite different from the first edition, because the second edition is more like, let's say, sugar-coated. If you can see, on the first edition was written here, published by Rivolta Femminile, the feminist group. If you see the cover of the second edition, there is not, because she was, I mean, the group of Rivolta Femminile was against that. But this is another issue that if you want, I can tell you afterwards, because it is too long. So the artist went on to continue her research on the sacred triangle, origin of life, emphasizing how Christianity appropriated these symbols from archaic sculpture to then give them other meanings, erasing their representation from the iconography. The matter, origin of all things, is silence, even though the pagan tradition is still underlining. In parallel, and then we come here to Maria Gimbutas. The Lithuanian archaeologist Maria Gimbutas carried out similar studies that were published in several books. The most famous of which is The Language of the Goddess, published here in United States in 1989. Gimbutas wrote, "The difficulties of the 20th century anthropological culture had with the term matriarchy lay in the fact of wanting to represent it as a complete and total mirror image of patriarchy or andocracy, or as a hierarchical structure in which women rule by force rather than men." But this is far from the truth. In ancient Europe and throughout the ancient world, we find no autocratic system of government by women accompanied by the repression of men. Instead, we find a structure in which the sexes are more or less in equal position, a society that we might define as Gilani, from Gine, referring to women, and andros, men, joined by the letter L, which stands for lien, line, to anti, to lie, to free. Gilani implies that the sexes are in mutual cooperation rather than hierarchically classified. Maria Gimbutas provides the link for this research, which features a common root from which much more research on gender has been developed. Suzanne Santoro, those work in some ways anticipated Maria Gimbutas' first essay, God and Goddess, in 1974. So this is the one of 1989 that you can see here from the image. So, but the first essay, if we compare the two publications, one is of Suzanne Santoro, and it was published in 1973, and the other is of Maria Gimbutas, and it was published in the first one in 1974. So the two researches are like going into parallel. But Maria Gimbutas was an archaeologist. So according to many scholars, Maria Gimbutas' research was a primary revelation, much like the Rosetta Stone for the religious thinking of the ancient Egypt. Her research demonstrated how these recurring signs were the true foundation of a religion that worshipped both the universe as body of the goddess mother creator, and all that lived within it as part of her divinity. This serves as proof, therefore, of how female iconography was never lost, but merely hidden. Her global influence was enormous in Maria Gimbutas, and she became a point of reference for feminists, especially in the United States. So if you have heard of the artist Carolee Schneemann, she's a quite famous American artist. But she was, Maria Gimbutas was really important, and she influenced many of these American feminist artists. But I'm not talking about American artists in this case. So this serves as proof, therefore, of how female, Maria Gimbutas, in her famous book, Language of the Goddess, unexpectedly included alongside her analysis of archaeological fossils, a fairly long historical narrative where she connected the witch hunts drawn out in blood by the arrival of the bellicose, patriarchal Indo-Europeans to all the evils of our history, up to being embodied in the figure of Stalin. The archaeologist who always maintained a strong connection with Lithuania seems to have wanted to present a peculiar interpretation of history, a patriotic narrative that would be difficult to fully understand without knowing its context within radical feminism. This book, Manifesto, continued to be really influential after the Soviet domination. And her warning to keep fighting the darkness of patriarchy has remained impressed in the minds of many women artists who went on to distinguish themselves after the fall of the Iron Curtain. You can go forward. As highlighted in many Lithuanian art critics at the time of the Soviet Union, there are many female artists in the country who played fundamental roles in the evolution of feminist thought, but whose style remained constrained by what the curator, Elona Lubite, would define silent modernism. The phenomenology, of the body played an important role for many Lithuanian women artists in the last decade of the 20th century. And the difference can be noted from the Italian women's artists of the 70s, for whom women's liberation depended on the liberation of the language, not of the body. In the 1970s in Italy, this went as far as the disengagement from the language codified in the masculine, moving toward a new visual writing to give body and life to one's own identity. Comparing the two periods, the early 1990s in Lithuania were marked by the constant testing of limits and the division that separated the thought from life was demolished. Lived experience became a representation of the body. Violeta Bubelite, that you can see here, works seem to exemplify this. You can see her in this photo. So for roughly 40 years, Bubelite has photographed herself nude in various contexts, showcasing her body exclusively as a creative instrument, material as spectator of itself. Although her works were not comprehended in the late 1980s, precisely because of that represent nudity, upon closer inspection, we can gather that her reflection was not exclusively on the self, but rather about becoming, about Mother Earth in a broader sense. In one of her essays, Raminta Jurenaite, another art critic, Lithuanian art critic, wrote, "The question who I am has been superseded by the question, what is human nature?" So I must say that Bubelite nudes are neither emancipatory provocation nor reflection of sexuality. If you go further, yeah, thank you, like this, each individual picture seems to be part of a complex system of sign, where the single one cannot live without being interconnected to the others. Similarly, understanding its unity makes it possible to embrace the whole. Bubelite's photographs seem to recall the complex symbolism illustrated by Maria Gimbutas, as I was putting the two images one beside the other. One is the findings, the archaeological findings of Maria Gimbutas, and the other are the poses of the body of Violeta Bubelite. So Bubelite's photograph seems to recall the complex symbolism illustrated by Maria Gimbutas in her studies of archaic Europe. The goddess appears in her entire phenomenology, from birth to death, to her regeneration. Symbols and images seems to coagulate around the body of the photographer to give life to a cosmogony of the matter, of the mother, in all its complexity. Egle Rakauskaite, okay, she's another quite famous artist, also, I mean, she has been famous also here. Now she's not anymore, but who knows? Egle Rakauskaite, on the other hand, detaches the body from the conventional scenario. It is subjected to and transform it into a personal becoming. In this case, I would like to highlight, you can go to the other image, a work that the artist Egle Rakauskaite, Trap Expulsion from Paradise, 1995, where the title already bears a reference to a profound rooting of Christianity in the social and political system of that time. So now, before continuing, I would like to stop the presentation of the images and start the presentation of For Guilty Without Guilt, Trap Expulsion from Paradise. You can see it? No, you need the two. So this is the second part of her work. Her work was initially divided into two parts. One, an installation in the former Jewish ghetto of Vilnius, Guilty Without Guilt, and the other, Trap, Expulsion from Paradise, which feature a living sculpture, as you can see here from the video. The work is centered on the relationship between the female body and society. Using the careful construction, the artist perform an analysis of dogmas and stereotypes that influence the public of women, the work's central element. Doesn't last long. If you want, I can go keep on telling you. 13 girls in white dresses, recalling innocence and virginal purity, form an apparently unbreakable netting, woven by the same plaits their hair is tiled with. So they are connected by the hair, by the plaits of the hair. Their mute immobility recalls a silent subjugation and indistinct plural that suddenly mutates in favor of the self. I won't go further. You can. You can use more. Ah, okay. Okay. So, as you can see, the scissor cut the plates that holds them together, proclaiming the end of an age marked by convention and axioms that influenced their existence. You can stop and then start again sharing. Is this one? Yes. Thank you. But, okay. So the ritualistic silence that permeates Rakauskaitė's work could be found in another work by the artist Leitvyde Šalčiūtė that you see here. Don't Die for Love is the other one. Yes, this is a very big photograph done in the beginning of the 20th century, so 2005 probably. But while the former work is strongly characterized by the invisible shadow of the totalitarian past, Šalčiūtė, in this case, in this work, seemed to want to break free from recent history to arrive at a paradoxical formalization of the self through intertextual and iconographic recomposition. The photograph becomes an ideogram, image and words, and inextricably linked, permeating each other with a new unique signifier. In this work, the biographical ego appears in opposition to the dogmatic ego. The position of the body, which recalls, of course, the deposition of Christ, is a clear reference to the teaching of the catechesis, the death of Jesus as an act of the personal love that God has for his people. And at the same time, the writing made with hairs on the legs, on the skin of her legs, "Don't Die for Love," is a prayer aimed at women. The short circuit produced this sentence combined with the construction of the image, brings us back to the perception of the work as universal truth, opening up question about that very truth. The women artists mentioned in this dissertation opened up inquiries on the figures of women within a system whose very framework rested on a hierarchical and religious society. All of them, in various ways, showed attention towards an identification of the self, moving towards a phenomenology of the self-validation, which falls outside recognition within what is pre-established and which aspires to be a manifestation of the imperceptible. To paraphrase Elisabeth Gross, instead of a politics, she said, of recognition in which subjected groups and minorities strive for a validated and affirmed place in public life, feminist and post-colonial politics should, Elisabeth Gross says, now consider the affirmation of what politics of imperceptibility, leaving its traces and effects everywhere, but never being able to be identified with a person or an organization. Okay, and then I can say that it is not a politics of visibility, of recognition, and of the self-validation, but a process of self-marking that constitutes oneself in the very model of that which oppresses and opposes the subject. The imperceptible is that which the human masters, that which the human can sometimes liberate from its own orbit, but not control or name as its own. A society, I would say, that would again open the doors to the goddess, the mother creator, studied by Maria Gimbutas. Thank you. So, questions?
Thank you, Benedetta. And yeah, I'm very glad to open up the floor for questions, comments, reflections, clarification.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I didn't know anything about it, but for me, it's a lot like new food. It's just like something that I saw when I saw the presentation about it.
Yes.
And so, like, just give us information related to, like, from a language perspective, like how we have the apostrophe without and now, like, it's like, but I was just more like mesmerized by the use of the color, and so like the reason why like
Black and white.
like yeah, and also then how it needs background has to be like that, and so I don't know if there's any information on the passport regarding like the use of the color.
The use of the color is really important, because if she had used any other color, she would have given other interpretation. This is the interpretation of the L that represents the absence of the verb, of the logos, or il verbo. So, so the L is her. The L represents the power of the language that exists without the verb, the logos. So it is important that the logos, that is the background, is black, not white, or any other color. Should I?
Yeah,
it was clear?
Yeah, I mean, like for me, I don't know, like I'm really important that like how to, you know, give a voice to a sort of minority, like some of that is not in the power, like society. Also that fact that we have this construct that is as you said, is like the important that the black there to stress there
I mean, it's not her as Mirella Bentivoglio, it's her as the language spoken by females. Because if we go at the 60s, the women in that society didn't have a role in the society as workers. I mean, even here, even in United States. So it was important to start this battle from the inside part, not from the outside part. So she was talking the same language of the man. So she was speaking the same language. At that time, there were several like artists that were working in this kind of scene, poesia visiva, visual poetry. But at that time, Mirella Bentivoglio and all the others, like Tommaso Binga, weren't recognized. Goodbye, thank you. Weren't recognized. Tommaso Binga is quite famous. I don't know if you know her, but she became famous only in her age of the 80s, not that time. So there was really an unequal difference between women artists and men artists. And so a women artist, to start to deconstruct the man language, they had to deconstruct from the inside part. Did I answer to you? Thank you. Yes, please.
I first saw it,
this one or this one?
yeah, we're like, there, and so the L is actually like still drifting into the background, which I just found very interesting, because like from what you described, it's like the opposite of what she that was another sort of look at it.
Yeah, you can look it at both ways, but at the same time, she was stressing the absence of this the background, the logos. I don't know if I got what you were talking about.
Yeah, it's really more that I just see a face in the black.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it can be, but actually there is no, because unfortunately you should see like, okay, this is like a printing, quite big, but it's a printing. And the printing, the background is totally black, and the L, and so it's, and the L is like emphasizing, so she's coming out, the L. She, I mean, is the L in Italian is female. Yes.
So the Bacente, that's a principle.
Yeah.
And the
The other, no, this is a sculpture. This is a sculpture, and she made several sculpture like this, and she's always played with the E, and how it works, because as I was telling you, is the verb to be. So, but at the same time, the verb to be needs, she's taking from the other E, A, that works as a conjunction. So is like, she's not really establishing herself like I am here, but I am here to be linked to somebody else, to be linked to you. So she takes the bar from the up from the top of the E to be herself. I don't know if it's okay. You were.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, well, I'm really fascinated by the L'Accente, also the fact that like apostrophe L is the only article in the Italian language that is actually is beyond like the gender binary, right?
Yeah.
It can be either masculine or feminine.
Yes.
So I think that's really fascinating, like what you said about kind of like taking like the voice of imposing herself in word of man, and also the fact that in the apostrophe, it's like the noun is implied, so they wouldn't have the apostrophe afterwards. There wasn't noun, right? So all of that. It's not really a question. I do have a real question. My real question is, since you mentioned obviously Lithuanian artists really emerging in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and really their emergence as being a reaction also to the oppressive occupation of the Union. I do wonder if you have any other kind of insight into how they related to the kind of feminism that was promoted inside the Soviet Union and like by in the Soviet context, right? Because the Soviets were like promoting their own kind of brand of quote unquote feminism.
Very good question, and thank you for asking me this. Yes, the artist, I didn't bring it here, I don't have the catalog. Okay. I'm always like looking for catalogs, but anyhow, I brought here also the language of the goddess. So I will, in the meantime, I'm replying to you. You can see this, this book. So I was telling you, most of the Lithuanian artists after the collapse of the Soviet Union wanted to acquire an identity as women, and completely in a different way from the Western feminist movement. Why? Because they acquired like embroidering, all the kind of things that were really related to the works that usually identifies the women that work in a house. So the two things are really different, because if you can imagine the feminist in Italy, in Western society, wants to be out of the house and not acquire an identity inside the house with during like female works like embroidery and so on. Because if you know this, during the Soviet Union, I'm not telling to you, but maybe to others who doesn't know, women were obliged to be as the men. So to do the same work as a man, very hard work, going to the factories. And so they weren't able to have their own lives. And they usually had to do both work, the kids and the factory work. So it was really a way of expressing herself as a human and as a lady as into, yes. Ah, Dio. So
I thought I was thinking about how it related to also the many courses, incredible courses, which women in fashion writing. I was reading an American feminist today, and she said something about how the topics of the body, the emotional interior, the domestic, the sexual, the relational, are all undervalued intellectual and associated with the female spirit. And I thought that was a beautiful way to convert and just reverence against what God is as a universal and loving creator, to actually, for it to actually not be about individualism or narcissism, but beyond intellectualism. What was the part of the first supposed to be talked about when I know that language? I was just wondering.
yes.
We're commenting about God being in this image, not limiting something, but himself being enclosed in the spirit.
Okay, yes, I can reply to this question with that book, The Language of the Goddess. Because I think that Maria Gimbutas is the, I could say the key of this answer. She said, we are speaking, and I was speaking about Dio, but Dio is not meant to be a male. But what if God were a woman? Question mark. I mean, Maria Gimbuta is telling that in the archaic society, God was a woman, because I'm speaking for me, as a woman, we are giving birth. Can be dual. We are regenerating ourselves. So in a sense, we have a strange, I mean, in that society, in the archaic society, we had this strange idea that women was the base, the central role of the society. So, but not in a sense that women is on top of the man, but in equalitarian way. And this is the key point. And also, God, Mother Earth, Goddess, is intended as really relating to our ecosystem. So to keeping, so we are like ecofeminism, this is that. This is the key. And the key is in Maria Gimbuta's studies. And if I can tell you, Maria Gimbutas, she arrived in 1947 from Lithuania without anything taken from her background, only her culture, herself. And it's quite fascinating because she was appointed as lecturer at Harvard University, but soon she understood that she didn't have any type of possibility to grow in that university, because she considered that university very andro-centered. And so she went to LA and she studied in UCLA. She taught at UCLA, and she managed to build up the first like interdisciplinary department, because there wasn't in the 1950 an interdisciplinary department in LA or in university. So she was working with psychologists, anthropologists, and she was a simple archaeologist, sorry. And if you put the image of, not of Suzanne, of Violeta Bubelite, yes, that one. If you go that one, no, it's the first, not the book. Yeah. Okay. If you see, goodbye. If you see those little statues that were like this, and they were simple, like archaeological findings, and they were interpreted as sex objects from the other archaeologists. And today, even there are many. I was this week, sorry, in Louisville. And I was speaking with a professor there of archaeology, and he was against her thesis, even now. I mean, this little statue weren't really at all objects for sexual like pleasure for men or for women. They were like really ritualistic objects. This idea of the big belly, the big breast, I mean, they had, and she also, if you see here, the background, she also interpreted all these signs. So the sign that is the triangle. So it is quite interesting what she said in this book, because she interpreted every single findings in like very in an interdisciplinary way. Sorry, I was long in the answer, but I. No, it's my interpretation. I made an interpretation, and for me, I mean, it's pretty clear like this, because she continued all her life in like photographing herself. I mean, not especially in this photograph that I picked out, but there are others that they are like linking to other positions that were found in the archaeological findings in, and we can find it in Gimbuta's work, book. So I think it's pretty much close, but I didn't have the chance to speak to her. So maybe yes, she's alive. She's around late 60s, 70s, something like this. She as Egle Rakauskaite is one of the oldest artists in Lithuania. All the others are really young, because the artist scene is really young and it's really powerful. If you go to see the last biennial, not this one that is on now in Venice, there was this Lithuanian pavilion that won the Golden Lion. So it was three girls, a group of three girls that made a wonderful installation in Venice. So if you do not have any other question, I would like you to thank you very much for being here to hear what I have to say. And thank you again, Luca, for the invitation. Thank you for for inviting me again. Thank you. Stai registrando? Can I ask you to have back the books, because I think Thank you.